Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Last week, when I attempted to answer the horror booktube tag, I confessed that I had never read any true horror. Instead, I talked about Victorian Gothic novels by authors such as the Bronte sisters, and 20th century Southern Gothic from authors like Carson McCullers and Flannery O'Connor. Well, one of my viewers tipped me off to a story by Stephen King, which that person thought might be of special interest to me. Let me back up for a moment. In that horror booktube tag, I mentioned that back in the mid-1980s, I had seen the screen adaptation of Stephen King's The Shining, the only modern horror movie I've ever seen. And I discussed a very direct link I see between The Shining and Jane Eyre. Today, I'm going to do something kind of similar and talk about the links between Stephen King's short story On Slide Inn Road and one of my favorite short stories, Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. The big difference here is that King himself acknowledged that his story was at least a bit of an homage to O'Connor. On Slide Inn Road is one of the short stories in Stephen King's new collection, You Like It Darker. It was initially published in Esquire magazine in the autumn of 2020. Recently, I talked about how much I love my local library, and this was yet another example of the bounty they offer. The library system acquired a ton of copies of You Like It Darker, but even so, there was a long line for a text or a digital copy of the collection. However, my library card enabled me to access for free a digital copy of the issue of Esquire published in 2020, and I could read the story that way. Okay, on to the text. I won't talk about the end of the stories until near the end of the video, and I'll give you a spoiler warning before then so you can step out of the room if you haven't yet read them both. But I will say that I think the endings really shed light on these two authors and raise some of both my questions about the genre of horror as well as my critique of King's approach. I encourage you to go read the two stories, or even to listen to my audiobook-style performance of the Flannery O'Connor story, which I'll link to in the description box before you watch the end part of the video. These two stories, King's and O'Connor's, revolve around families on a car trip who travel off the main highway. O'Connor's story is about a mother, a father, two young children, and a grandmother driving through the state of Georgia in the southeast corner of the U.S. on their way to Florida for a vacation. King's story is directly parallel but not identical. A mother, a father, two young children, and a grandfather driving through Maine in the northeast corner of the U.S. to visit the grandfather's dying sister. In Georgia, the grandmother wants to go see an old plantation house she thinks she remembers. In Maine, the grandfather points out the remains of a burned-out hotel he stayed in when he was younger. Then, in both stories, the family stops because of some kind of car trouble, and then run across a polite set of killers on the loose who threaten the families. In both stories, the grandparent is carrying a suitcase that doesn't hold clothing or other necessities. In A Good Man is Hard to Find, the grandmother has brought the cat with her without the knowledge or permission of the rest of the family. She can't bear to leave it at home. And when they have their little car accident, the kitty is terrified and jumps out. In other words, while O'Connor doesn't say it directly, in this moment we have the literalization of a cliche. The cat was out of the bag. And we start to learn the truth of what is happening in the story. When you read it, keep your eyes peeled for other literalizations that occur in her story. She doesn't actually use the cliches directly in her writing, but she has these playful echoes of them throughout. I think today we might call these Easter eggs, maybe. Well, on Slide Inn Road, in contrast, the grandfather has brought a bag full of baseball memorabilia with him, as well as a collection of old comic books. The baseball cards and signatures, etc., all belonged to his sister when she was young. Instead of bringing these items of nostalgia with him secretly, he talks about them incessantly, bragging about the value of the baseball glove and the bat, even though the mother and father are quite a bit more skeptical of their worth. And he pushes the old comic books on the children, too. Interestingly, there's a fleeting reference to the funny papers in Flannery O'Connor's story. In King's story, both of these things, the comics and the baseball memorabilia, are pretty important in the ending, at least as I see it. More on that later. Where O'Connor uses these hidden literalizations of cliches, King uses cliches and stock phrases far more directly and more frequently, and not in the voices of the characters, but just in the narration. I didn't love his style, but still, the banal and sometimes a bit vulgar narration does paint a good picture of how the family thinks about the world, how disrespectful the characters are to each other, something that's actually quite important in both stories. I've already told you that both families are going to encounter killers as they travel on these dirt roads somewhere off the highway. It comes as an out-of-the-blue surprise for King's family. After their little car issue, the kids go up to explore what's left of the old inn. And while on their adventure, they meet a pair of friendly murderers. One of the two kids spots a human leg sticking up out of the muck, and he starts to get an inkling that something might be wrong. And a few minutes later, when he meets back up with his family, he whispers it to his grandfather. None of the rest of the family members seem to know or suspect. So that's where the tension lies here. Only moments before the immediate threat of violence do we start to get nervous for our family. Well, I suppose I really should take that back because everyone knows they're reading something in the horror genre. I guess everyone is just waiting for something truly horrific to happen. But it isn't established directly in the narrative, just as a fact of the genre. In contrast, Flannery O'Connor sets up the narrative suspense much earlier, but we don't have any assumption that it's going to be real. The grandmother reads about a hardened criminal, the misfit, and his merry men roaming around in Florida, and she uses that fact to try to convince her son that they should vacation not in Florida, but in East Tennessee, which is where she actually wanted to go. She tries to use the misfit to persuade him, but no dice. For the next few pages, as the family travels down the highway, we get some irritatingly silly and prejudiced stories from the grandmother, and all the while the other family members are basically rolling their eyes. Eventually, they stop for lunch, and while they're in the little restaurant, the grandmother chit-chats with the owner. She asks him if he's heard about the escaped criminal. And the owner responds, "I wouldn't be a bit surprised if he didn't attack this place right here," and keeps going with that idea for a few more sentences. Still, while the misfit was real, and no one doubted it, none of them actually expected to run into him and his gang. These are two different ways of creating tension, yes? King is effectively using the jump out of the shadows version of suddenly coming across a dead body, or dead body parts in this case. O'Connor is using the knowledge that evil is out there, but with characters assuming there's no way it will really affect them, even if they kind of joke about the fact that it could. So something is looming over O'Connor's family from the very beginning. King makes several other little references to O'Connor's story. One example is that the grandmother uses a slur about black Southerners, while the grandfather in the King story uses a slur about the Vietnamese. And in both cases, the younger generations are cringing a bit. Another example of similarity. Before the car accident, a big scene of A Good Man Is Hard to Find features a character named Red Sammy, who runs the casual roadside barbecue joint. It immediately follows a story about watermelon. In On Slide In Road, King makes a reference to a roadside quick shop called the Red Apple. Okay, I think from here on out, I'm getting into spoiler territory, which you might not want to hear if you're planning to read the stories, unless you're like me and don't mind spoilers at all. Well, earlier I said that in King's story, the family members really question the grandfather's belief in the value of the baseball equipment. In the end, it turns out that he is right. They are very valuable, although not in the way he believed earlier. After the two men have helped the family move their car out of the ditch and back onto the road, they basically ask for all the money in the family's wallets. The family members, at least the grandfather, realize that giving the men the money isn't going to solve anything, since the killers know the young son knows that they're killers, and they don't want to be exposed publicly. The grandfather tries to bargain with them, saying that he has thousands of dollars in his bag, which he was taking to help pay for his sister's funeral when she died. He leads one of the men to the car, digs through the bag, and starts talking about how valuable the baseball stuff is. It seems to the killer and to the reader that he might have just been lying about having cash and just wanted to convince them that these items were valuable enough that they should let the family go. After going through some of the small stuff, he pulls out a bat with a famous signature on it. And although the young killer has been frustrated by the tour through the memorabilia before, there is this moment suddenly when he expresses interest. "How'd your sister come by it?" he asked the grandfather. It feels like this strange little miracle of actual communication. And the grandfather answers. Actually, let me just read you the text. "Just gave him a smile and a wink when he came down Autograph Alley," Grandpop says, and swings the bat. It connects with the killer's temple. His scalp pops open like a window shade, and blood flies up. I won't go into the details about what happens to the other killer, but suffice it to say that he too was neutralized. Now, while I personally think this portrayal is pretty gross, it isn't horror. Am I right there? At least it doesn't feel like horror to me. It feels more like comic strip violence. And given that comic books are important here, I think that might be what King intended. As the story wraps up in the next handful of paragraphs, the comic book feel comes out even more as the mild-mannered grandpop, who was chipper but very much not the alpha male in that family car, becomes the Ubermensch, superhero, writing the social order in his favor. He tells off his son for not trying to save him. Quote, "You had a chance and just stood there. You could have got me killed, got all of us killed." Grandpop slaps his son Frank across the face. And after they're all in the car again, the son starts mouthing off at his father for something, and at this point the story ends when his wife turns to him and says, "Shut up, Frank, please, just this once." And Frank does. Honestly, I find this ending to be unsatisfying and pretty lightweight. King was clearly trying to reverse a lot of the action of Flannery O'Connor's story, while also making lots of allusions to her work. There's very little I love more than authors making literary allusions, especially when they're playful, and especially when they're coming from somewhat unexpected quarters. Still, this ending didn't seem to have anything persuasive to say, except that the older man thought his son was not enough of a man to call himself one. Interestingly, "A good man is hard to find" is a lot more horrific than On Slide End Road. O'Connor also has a point to make that is much more complicated, and I think its nuance is one of the reasons the story has stuck with me for years and years. I'm not going to go into detail about her ending because I've talked about it a lot before, but I want to point out just a couple of parallel plot points that King creates in Mirror Image. First, there are those last lines. After the grandmother lies dead on the ground, the misfit tells one of his underthugs to shut up, instead of the wife telling the husband to shut up, as it happens in the King story. Here's O'Connor's version. "Some fun," Bobby Lee said. The misfit responds. "Shut up, Bobby Lee," the misfit said. "It's no real pleasure in life." But maybe the most important distinction is the two different portrayals of that magical moment of connection. Stephen King has the thug respond with wonder of how the sister came to own the baseball bat. It means something, because no one in his family acted particularly interested. But it doesn't mean very much, right? In O'Connor's, the one who feels the connection is the grandmother towards the misfit, who has just bared his soul about why he's turned to violence. And the answer is strange and thoughtful and crazy and religious. And after hearing it, the grandmother suddenly has unbelievable sympathy for the misfit. And in that moment, her silly, cliched approach to life completely lifts. "Why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children." I'll be rereading Flannery O'Connor's story again and again, but not Stephen King's story, I don't think. Well, that will do it for today's horror. Thanks for joining me here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.